Okay, there is no auditorium teacher. There is no teacher for the back. So I'm the teacher for both of those classes, and that will be in here. Last week, Mark was good enough to bring his class in here. And during this quarter, the first three weeks of the 13 weeks, Mark took that. I'll be taking the next 4 weeks. And then Tony will take 3 after that. And then Jimmy, I think, takes 3 after that. We have 4 different teachers to complete this thing. There are many things that we read and take for granted in the Scriptures that we just read over and say, yeah, I understand what that means. But I don't think it does us any good to talk about things unless we make application of those particular things. What we're going to do, we're going to talk about Proverbs 6 and verses 16 to 19, the 7 sins that God hates. This was not only true in the Old Testament, but it's true in the New Testament. And tonight, we will probably cover just the first one. And after that, we may be able to cover more than one. But this one is one that most people really don't think much about when they're studying. Do you realize that this particular sin can cause people to falsely accuse others? It can cause people to lie. It can cause people to deal unfairly with others. It can stir up strife. It can make a person refuse to seek God. It can make a person become a respecter of persons. It can cause a person to neglect their duties in the church. It can cause a person to be boastful. It can cause a person to be conceited. And it can cause a person to refuse to repent. So knowing all those things, that of course there's more than one sin that can do that. Knowing all those things, well, we need to think about what we've got. In Proverbs 6 and 16 to 19, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7, are an abomination to him: a proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, and heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that soweth discord among the brethren. So that's a pretty extensive list. So I want to start off by looking at Proverbs chapter 6, and let's back up here to, as soon as I get my sheets undone here. As soon as I find number 1, we'll be ready to go. May be ready to go without it. Not sure without that. Here it is. Okay, hiding in the book. Let's back up before we get to verse 6, or to verse 16. And let's talk about this sin a little bit. We're going to be talking tonight about the first mention that he makes there, and that's a proud look. Normally when we read that, we don't think too much about it. But when we analyze what a proud look means, we see what kind of trouble that we can get into by participating in something like that. But back up in verse 12, he talks about, in talking about things the Lord hates, he says, a naughty person, a wicked man, walketh with a froward mouth. He winketh with his eyes, he speaketh with his feet, he teacheth with his fingers. Frowardness is in his heart, he devises mischief continually. He soweth discord, therefore shall his calamity come suddenly, and suddenly shall he be broken without remedy. Now this froward mouth that he talks about with this naughty person is what gets a lot of us into trouble. This is the word froward means stubbornly, willful, or unruly. You know, James talks a lot about the tongue being something that no man can tame, but we know we can control it. You know, we can't tame it, but we can control it and work on controlling it. And that's what the seed of this thing is. It says, the seed of the evil man's iniquity and perverseness is in his heart. He deliberately premeditates and plots the course of his diabolical schemes. And then he goes and talks about these things that different individuals might be talking about. The first one of these we want to talk about is a proud look. A proud look is we understand to be a haughty, exalted, lofty, self-righteous attitude. Now, there are members of the church that are like this. There's also a lot of people in the world that are like this. You know, normally we don't talk about a proud look. We talk about somebody that's self-centered or somebody that's, it's all about them. And, the interesting thing is most people don't want to be around that person. And the sad thing is that person doesn't ever seem to understand that because they actually never change. And so if it's all about you, I know I've known, my father-in-law had a neighbor that if you went over and talked to him, it didn't matter what you said, he had something better. Didn't matter what kind of car you had, he had a better one, And so it was, anytime you went over there, you knew that you were going to be, he's going to talk down to you and try to be a exalted and haughty type person. But this is actually the opposite of what God requires. Matthew 5:3 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now I know we're talking about the Beatitudes. I'm totally aware of that. But let's take a little bit of an in-depth look at what that means. So it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." We have our kids to memorize these Beatitudes. And they can do that. But many times the kids can't tell you exactly what they mean. But the poor in spirit are those whose minds are suited to a humble station in life. In other words, it's the opposite of being haughty and self-centered and things like that. Jesus was a humble person. He was our example. The poor means destitute of something. Poor in spirit means those who are destitute of that bad pride. They're destitute of being haughty. They're destitute of being arrogant. And they're destitute of the spirit of the world. By the poor in spirit are meant those who are sensible to spiritual destitution and long for a better state of life. So this doesn't just make a statement. It talks about an attitude that this person has. You ever talk to somebody and it doesn't take you long to see if they're humble? It doesn't take you long to see where their inner lies. If it's in self, if it's in physical things or spiritual things. We had a preacher in the Church of God down in Gallipolis that we converted and sent him to preacher school. And he really was good on the scriptures. He couldn't rightly divide the word, of course, but he learned to do that. But if he came to visit you, you wouldn't be there 5 minutes until you'd be talking about something spiritual. He didn't talk about fishing, hunting, anything. It was, you knew that was coming. It wouldn't be 5 minutes until he'd be talking about those things. And so when you talk to an individual, you can see where their heart lies. Normally this poor in spirit person are those who are opposite of the proud, righteous, as we said. It describes someone who is contrite and reverent. When we read the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we talk about love. A lot of people have this framed up and hanging in their bedroom or in their dining room or someplace. But those are things that we should cultivate as far as love is concerned. Love is closely intertwined with this because the scriptures tell us that wherever, that your heart is where what is? That's where your treasure is. So if people are excited about their treasure, they're going to talk a lot about it. So you know where a person's heart is, and these people are people who are contrite and reverent. They have a sense of their own unworthiness. That's a hard one to come by sometimes. These people who are poor in spirit, they, look at others as being better than themselves. Now, we'll talk in a minute about the fact that you can't trample yourself down and feel like you're worth nothing, but there's a balance there that you have to achieve. The prodigal son and his older brother. When the prodigal son came home, he learned his lesson. And he came to his father with the attitude of, look, I just want to be a servant. And his brother's problem was, gee, look at all I've done. I've been here and done what you asked me to do. And he ran off and, wasted his money with the riotous living. And now you make a party for him. You never made a party for me. And so that was the attitude of the brother. Then, of course, we're all familiar with the publican and the Pharisee there when they were talking about what they had achieved. Of course, the sinner hadn't achieved anything, but the publican, these are things that help us to cultivate this humble attitude. Pride and haughtiness or an attitude of self-sufficiency lead some to ruin. In other words, we can't have a low estimate of ourselves. We need to be somebody that can trust not only in God but in ourselves and have that, perfect balance. But it gives, by being prideful, you don't give glory to God, you give glory to yourself. If you're a humble person, you give the glory to God. Remember old Nebuchadnezzar? He didn't learn his lesson the easy way. He says, the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. He took credit. God didn't appreciate that. He says, you know what? You've got to learn a lesson. And he learned that lesson the hard way. But it prevents, not being poor in spirit, keeps a lot of people from being productive in the Lord's kingdom. It hinders actually people admitting that they've done anything wrong. It causes contentions within the church by people who are already members. And sometimes it causes people to leave the church. We sit and wonder sometimes why somebody that you knew for years, all of a sudden they just leave the church. They decide that they have a better way, that they don't want to listen to what God says anymore. So, being humble, you're not going to have that to happen to you. So we want to realize that the poor in spirit is a type person that we need to cultivate. We need to be humble, and we can cultivate that. James 1:25 says, whoever looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed indeed. 1 Peter 2:21, for even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. But humility has blessings to be enjoyed. The kingdom of heaven is theirs, the humble, and only those who are humble will seek it. But the proud will certainly miss the mark. So when we talk about being this person who is in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, it's because of their attitude. It's because of their estimation of their worth and God's worth being in sync. A statement was made one time that God makes something out of nothing. And until you become nothing, he can't make anything good out of you. So you got to get rid of self, as far as your priorities are concerned and your attitude is concerned for this, to work. But anyway, looking at this list of 7 things that God hates, he says that, they are an abomination. Abomination means great hatred and disgust, to dislike very much. And so, these things are very bad, they're unpleasant, they're vile to God. And so we don't want to end up being like that in any way. So as we are studying this, let's remember how much God hates this. Because he knows the destructive power of self. He knows the destructive influence of self. And you know, if someone is, many times we tell our young people, and I think Travis and I were talking about this, pick somebody for a role model. You know, somebody in the church that you say, you know what, that is a good example of a Christian. You know, Paul said, follow Christ, follow me as I follow Christ. You know, he imitated Christ, he wanted you to imitate him. But how many of us could honestly say we'd be a good role model? Would you want somebody to be a Christian just like you, as far as your attitude's concerned? And if they were questioned about you, how would they evaluate you? You know, it's a good feeling for a young person. You can tell, when you're around young people, who they want to be like. Now, we're not talking about outside the church like super football player or something like that. We're talking about a person who is a super spiritual person. But when we think about that proud look and all these other things that he lists, we've got to ask ourselves, are we a good role model? There was let's talk about, I remember before Muhammad Ali died, he was kind of the example of a pompous, involved individual. But the story is told that he was getting ready to leave the airport and he was on an airplane. And the flight attendant passed by and she said, "Please fasten your seatbelt." And he said, "Superman don't need no seatbelt." And she said, "Superman don't need no airplane." So, so he got the point, and fastened his seatbelt. But we always want to remember that there are things that we can do that will help us tremendously on our Christian journey. And one of those things is listening to, what people tell us. In Matthew 20, verses 20 to 28, Matthew 20, turn there, Matthew 20, verses 20 to 28. Then came to him the mother of Zebedee's children, James and John, of course, children with their sons, worshiping him and desiring a certain thing of him. And he said unto her, "Wilt thou?" She said unto him, "Grant that my two sons be set, the one on the right hand and the one on the left hand, in thy kingdom." So he wanted special treatment. But Jesus answered and said, "Ye know not what you ask. Are ye able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They say unto him, "We are able." And he said, "Ye shall indeed drink of my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared of my Father." So they were asking for something that wasn't his to do, but look at where their heart was, where the mother's heart was. They were close. He was very close to these two individuals and into that inner circle, and they figured, of course you can imagine, well, we know it tells us what it did to the others that heard it. They resented that, that these two would try to assert themselves and put themselves above. It says here, verse 24, "And when the 10 heard it, they were moved with indignation against the two brethren." Oh, got trouble already. But Jesus called them unto him and said, "Ye know the prince of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they are great exercise authority upon you, but it shall not be among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister, and whoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant." So he gave them a lesson firsthand in humility and telling them that's not what's important. You sitting on the right hand and left hand, that's not what's important. What's important is that you know where your place is going to be. Philippians 2 and verses 3 to 8. Philippians 2. There are just numerous scriptures that deal with this particular subject. Philippians 2, verses 3 to 8. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. And that's important to think about that, because, Jesus was that example. He exhibited the greatest degree of self-denial in leaving heaven, coming here and dying, taking on the form of man and dying for the sins of the world. If he could do that, then how much is it asking of you to humbly submit, to the Father's will? 1 Peter 2, verses 21 to 23, for even unto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again, when he suffered, he threatened not, and committed himself to him that judges rightly. The thing I always think about when I think about that is, when he was being questioned before his crucifixion, he wouldn't defend himself. And so he knew what his task was, and he was really willing to do that. But let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. What's vainglory? Do you understand what that is? It's that self-boasting or pride is actually what it is. Vain means vain, and glory means, you're glorifying yourself, of course. I like this. It says, pride means to inflate with self-conceit and be high-minded. In other words, the opinion you have of yourself. I like what Martin Luther said, and I quoted that a while ago. It says, God created out of nothing, therefore until a man is nothing, God can make nothing out of him. And Psalm 10 and verses 1 to 4 basically says, the wicked will not seek after God. If you don't seek him, then you're not, going to find him. But the book of Psalms is full of condemnation of pride. Matthew 7 verses 20 and 23, Jesus said pride comes from an evil heart. So your heart's your mind. These things develop, and we all think differently. We don't understand some of the things criminals do. We don't understand, but in this case, some people are spiritual criminals. We don't understand their thinking in the way that they, reason through stuff. In looking at pride, we need to ask ourselves, is this a big sin or a little sin? We have a tendency to minimize some things. And pride's mentioned many, many times in the scriptures. And many, many times we're not very concerned about it because we think, that's, you're not murdering somebody, you're not taking God's name in vain, But we tend to minimize that. But remember, Isaiah 55 and 8 says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. So the way God looks at things and the way we look at things is different. But pride in this list is number one on God's list of things that he hates. They're an abomination to him. And of course, we use this, we talk about this all the time in our classes. But pride was the seed of the original sin. That's what the devil knew that. And, when he told Eve, God knows that when you eat this, you shall be as gods. Dang, that was the magic thing right there. She wanted that. And so she, took that fruit. But Jesus was never proud. In Matthew 11 and 29, he said, I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest to your souls. And so Jesus was the example of humility and weakness. Matthew 18 and 4, Jesus made it plain. We talked about the little children. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Peter preached about humility. Let's look at 1 Peter 5 and verses 5 to 6. 1 Peter 5 and verses 5 to 6. First Peter 5, verses 5 and 6. Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. And so, people may have that type of pride here and exalt themselves here, but when the judgment day comes, they could be in a lot of trouble. So Jesus preached it, Peter preached it, James said in James 4:6 that God resists the proud. Paul said he served the Lord with all humility of mind, and nobody went through any more than Paul did. He never gave up. And he did some rough preaching. He wasn't always a loving, friendly guy. I mean, he told it like it was. But still, he served the Lord with all humility. Pride was the sin that destroyed Judah, Moab, go read the story, Babylon, Sodom, Egypt, Israel, Syria, you name it. Many of the cities that fell in the Old Testament were because of pride. Why do you think there's wars in the world? This is look at Hitler. When he declared his race to be a superior race. Can't get any more prideful than that. So wars cause people to kill people. Wars cause us to have a lot of issues that we don't need to have. Pride, and of course we're warned about this in 1 Timothy 3 and 6. Pride can destroy an eldership. It can destroy an elder. That's why it says, one of the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3:6, not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he falls into the condemnation of the devil. So, now there are many people that become elders when they're younger instead of when they're older, and they've done well. I'm not saying they don't. But you've got to really evaluate a person's maturity level and make sure that this doesn't, as we say, go to their head and cause them to be a problem, because when you're dealing with people, it's difficult enough, and you shouldn't have to deal with an immature elder. It can also destroy preachers. A lot of times, young people straight out of school, they're not open to criticism. They have an inflated ego. They get up and exalt themselves in the pulpit. The Scripture says, sirs, we would see Jesus. And that's what people need to see. They don't need to see a person who says, I really can't stand his preaching. Too much of self is up there. They may brag on themselves or, have a false sense of importance. They may be a lover of self. They may have a false sense of their knowledge. They may go in to a congregation that has no elders and may teach people error and cause that congregation to apostatize. When we were at Hurricane, West Virginia, they had good elders, and I wasn't there. We left, and 10 years later, I told you this story before, I was at the mall in Huntington, West Virginia, met one of the members from that congregation that told me that he finally learned that we were saved by grace alone. And I couldn't believe it. I'm like, how could that happen? These elders were tremendous. I don't know what happened. I know they built another building on top of the hill within sight of the first one, and there was a split and all this kind of stuff. But also, pride, the pride of life, is one of the sources of sin mentioned in 1 John 2 and 16. It says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And again, we go back even to Matthew 4, when Jesus was being tempted of Satan. And all these things were thrown in his direction. All those temptations that Satan wanted to see if he could withstand those. But one statement I found that was kind of interesting. It says, people who sing their own praises do so without accompaniment. That's kind of, I guess it's easy to look, at someone who has a pride issue that doesn't seem to get the point and wonder if they have figured it out yet, that they're going the wrong direction. Pride also causes some people to reject the elders. That's an issue I've seen before. Hebrews 13:17 tells us to obey those that have the rule over us. Why? Because those elders are going to have to give an answer for their shepherding you as an individual. And so elders are interested in everybody. But a lot of times elders are falsely accused, or somebody doesn't agree with what they said. Sometimes it may be correct. Sometimes the elder may be wrong. Hopefully that doesn't happen very often. But be careful, when you go to opposing an elder, because they have a big job to do. Job 40:12 says, Look on everyone that is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. The Old Testament is a great place to read about pride. The book of Proverbs is a great place to read about pride and the things that it does. But God keeps his distance from the proud. Matthew 23:12 says, Whoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. I like Isaiah 13:11. I don't know I've ever heard much read on that. Isaiah 13:11, God says, And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. And I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. So he mentions pride and haughtiness. Isn't that amazing in that one verse where he talks about, I'll punish the world for their evil? He makes a point to bring out those two things. Jeremiah 13:15 says, Hear ye and give ear, be not proud, for the Lord hath spoken. So evidently, back through time, from the time the first sin was committed in the Garden of Eden, and even today, we work against pride. New preachers, new teachers, new elders. That's why we all need to study so we know the truth. And no one can come in and lead us astray. It's important. You can't depend on the preacher or an elder or a teacher to be the only ones that are responsible for being able to teach. We all need to be searching that word, and as the scriptures tell us, be ready always to give an answer for the hope that's in you. And we tell people during our services, if you have a question about what we teach, come and talk to us. We like the chapter and verse issue. And the Church of Christ should be known for that, and it is most places. But if you're a person that has the wrong evaluation of yourself, think about it. And think about how other people look at you. Does anybody look at you as being haughty, an egocentric person, someone who doesn't really like to, I've heard people say, oh no, here they come. They try to go the other direction or hope somebody comes up and interrupts them, because you can't get away from that individual. And so, where does our heart lie? Where does our treasure lie? That's what we need to decide. But let's try to be the kind of person that Jesus was. Let's deal with humility. We were talking there a while ago about Jesus' humility. He was willing to leave heaven. He died on the cross because that was more important than what he was. And so, what's our priorities? I think that was the bell. Something went there. I heard this. No, that's what it was. Next 3 weeks, we will cover these other 6. I thought I'd cover this in a little more detail because the others kind of hinge on this one. this is actually a part of those others. Thanks.